Hello, Tim Bontemps here, ESPN NBA writer, here with my buddy, the Machine, Kevin Pelton, also ESPN NBA writer. Two of us teamed up on a story looking at what the definition of all in the NBA is. This came on the heels of Kevin's idea, came on the heels of the Rudy Gobert trade to the Minnesota Timberwolves. And you always hear all the time in the NBA, teams are going all in. The Timberwolves went all in, traded all these picks to get Rudy Gobert. But in general, you don't look at the Timberwolves even with Rudy and think they're going to win a championship. So what does going all in mean? So Kevin and I broke down where all 30 teams rank in terms of what direction of all in they're going in, had 7 different groups. And we're going to go through and talk about some of the teams that stood out to us or the ones that we had the most disagreements on throughout the process of hashing this out on the phone over probably an hour? We probably talked about this, KP?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Going through everything.
And you had kind of the idea of doing these different tiers. I was originally thinking like a scale of all inness from have given up the most draft picks and have kind of the oldest roster to vice versa. But this was a better way, I think, to kind of frame everything. And, I don't think we really had any disagreement about the 6 teams that we had in the all in on a championship this season group. Those ones are kind of obvious, I think.
Yeah, let's just do us a favor. We'll just touch on that group and then we'll run through. So who did we have in that first group? So people, and obviously this is on .com, people can go read it there.
Yeah, we had the Brooklyn Nets, the LA Clippers, the Miami Heat, the Milwaukee Bucks, the Philadelphia 76ers, and the Phoenix Suns.
And obviously the way we broke this down was teams that are in the all in to win this year, obviously veteran rosters, older rosters, also have traded a lot of draft picks in the future. They don't have a lot of ammo left in the tank to get better down the road. Probably 3, 4, 5 years from now, these teams aren't going to be in this same category. But right now, you can at least make an argument they all can win. So that's how we had all of them. So the interesting discussion started to come about in this next group of teams.
Yeah, which we called all in on a championship over the next 5 seasons. And we had Boston, Denver, Golden State, and Memphis in there. And the Warriors are maybe the most interesting because it's kind of funny to have the team that won the championship last year, not in all in on a championship this season. But that to me, the Warriors were kind of the vision of what this entire thing was, because going back to Joe Lacob referencing trying to, be a contending team for decades to come and being light
years ahead, I believe was the phrase, KP.
I was going to get there. I wasn't going to forget that. That's always been this concept of how can we balance competing now with this core of Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson that has won now 4 championships, but also be developing that next core with James Wiseman, Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody, who we hope are going to kind of take over and allow us to continue to compete even after those guys have aged out of it a little bit.
Yeah, I was more in the all in on winning now category with this group. They didn't really fit in either camp for me because I don't necessarily believe in these young guys being good enough to really be a bridge to the future. And while they do have their picks, they're obviously reliant on 3 guys in Steph Curry, Draymond Green, and Klay Thompson that are all in their, mid 30s now, have all had injury issues. Like there's a lot more downside risk there. You look at Boston, Denver, and Memphis, they're all teams that have assets going forward, also are very young, have young guys entering their prime as their key players. So they all kind of fit in that group, I think, for sure. Golden State's probably here, to your point, by default. You obviously lean harder this way than me, but that is just proof that the Warriors have done a good job of not only being able to be contenders now, but also have a shelf life of a few years ahead if they manage things right. So let's go on to the next group after that.
So the next group we had all in on playoff success. And this is where the Minnesota Timberwolves, as you talked about at the top, come in, along with the Atlanta Hawks, who also made a big trade, sending out multiple first-round picks for DeJounte Murray this summer, the Chicago Bulls, and the Portland Trail Blazers. Those 2 teams have already made those trades, sending out a lot of future first-round picks, but we don't look at them right now as championship contenders.
Yeah, and you didn't like having Portland in this group, which I'll let you get into in a minute. My rationale for putting them here was, whether it's logical or not, Blazers people would say, with Dame Lillard, Jeremy Grant, Yusuf Nurkic, the group they have, their expectation is to be competitive enough to win a playoff series. Like if they do that, I think people in Portland will be pretty happy. I don't think they're good enough to do that. I know you don't think they're good enough to do that. That's why you would have had them in a lower tier. But I guess with some of the teams that are a little bit farther down the list that we'll get to, if the Blazers are 41-41, I think they'll be disappointed. whereas some of these teams are just going to be happy to be a 500 team. So that was my argument for why they would be here.
Yeah, it gets to be a pretty granular distinction at some point between the extremes of these tiers. I mean, that's always going to happen, that you're going to have some teams kind of fall in between. And Portland, I think it's just, as you said, a question of what are the reasonable expectations for this team coming off of a season where, they ended up in the lottery and were headed that direction even before Damian Lillard got shut down for the season with the abdominal surgery. And part of the question is, are we going to see the Dame Lillard that we saw as recently as 2 years ago when he was a top 10 player in the league? Will that abdominal surgery get him back to that level?
Well, and so what is as the machine, what is your early projection for what a reasonable expectation for the Blazers are to just really depress Blazers fans?
Yeah, I mean, I have them in the play-in tier. I don't think there's like a huge difference between them and Sacramento necessarily, which is also what the ESPN summer forecast. I think there was only a 1-game difference between them and the standings, and I think our projection for them was something like 35-47, which is rough.
Yes, it's not great. I think Portland's going to be a little better than that. But look,
Agreed.
the top of the West is also tough. Like, they're probably in that band with the Lakers and the Kings. And to your point, it might just come down to the health of Dame and those guys. But at the same time, if the Blazers finish 10th, they're, I think, going to be pretty disappointed about how their season goes. You mentioned Sacramento. They come up in this next tier. If Sacramento finishes 10th, they're not going to be disappointed.
We're going to win 40 games this year. That's the rallying cry. So that's the group that is all in on finishing 500 this season, including those Kings, the New York Knicks, and the Washington Wizards. And the Knicks are maybe an interesting team out of this group in terms of just what happens if they make a trade for Donovan Mitchell, which all of a sudden, I think their aspirations get a lot higher.
Yeah, they probably then shift into the same group as Portland, right? Which maybe it's all in on unrealistic expectations. Maybe we should have had an 8th group. Because like the Knicks will be very much like Portland then, right? They'll have a tentpole star in Donovan Mitchell. They'll have expectations that come with having a tentpole star of being a, legitimate playoff team in the East. But you look at their team and they're probably still more likely to be a borderline play-in tournament team than a team that's going to be pushing for the top 6, let alone the top 4. And so I do think there's a lot of parallels there. Obviously, there's always expectations in New York, even when the team is not really going to be good. And certainly if they do get Donovan Mitchell, which I think just about everybody in the league expects to happen at some point, that will only ratchet those expectations up further, but certainly will be interesting to see what happens there. And yeah, I mean, Washington and Sacramento are sort of the Eastern and Western Conference versions of themselves. Washington's had a little bit more success, but both those teams, Washington re-signed Bradley Beal, Sacramento traded Tyrese Haliburton for Domantas Sabonis, went and hired Mike Brown. Like their goal clearly is going to be as good as humanly possible this year, whatever that is. And after not making the playoffs for close to 2 decades now, they would love to get into the play-in tournament, let alone get into the playoffs. I'm not sure they'll be able to do it as we just laid out, but certainly their expectation level is different than the teams above them, which is why, ultimately we had them in this group.
Yeah, I mean, I think Washington epitomizes this group more than anyone else. They've got out a ton of future first-round picks, but the Beal contract, it really kind of sets them on this path that they've been on for a period of time where our goal is to try to be, a 7th or 8th playoff seed. And we don't necessarily have a lot of realistic aspirations above that. But we've also, we're trying to do it every year. Sacramento, I will say, I think Kings fans could make a little bit of a case that they could be all in on their young core. They've got Keegan Murray as the number 4 pick of this year, who was, really impressive during summer league. They've got some other young talent, but now out a first round pick from the Kevin Huerter trade. And then, as you mentioned, trading young for slightly older and closer to free agency in the Haliburton Sabonis trade is what I think stuck them in this tier for us.
No question. A good segue, though, to talk about young cores. Let's lay out the next tier of teams that are all in on their young cores.
Yeah, we had 5 teams in this group: the Charlotte Hornets, the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Detroit Pistons, the New Orleans Pelicans, and the Oklahoma City Thunder.
Yeah, this group was interesting because obviously all these teams have young talent, right? Cleveland's got Garland, Mobley, and Allen. The Pistons have Sadiq Bey, Cade Cunningham, Isaiah Stewart. They then drafted Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren. In this year's draft, the Pelicans obviously have a ton of draft picks, as do the Thunder. They both have young talent, Zion and Brandon Ingram in New Orleans, Chet Holmgren, Josh Giddey, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander with the Thunder. I'm forgetting I skipped over a team in the middle. Who was the fifth team we had in there? I had Cleveland, Detroit. I'm talking about Cleveland, Detroit, New Orleans, and Oklahoma City. I know I skipped somebody. And Charlotte, right. Charlotte was another one that's a little weird to put somewhere. Obviously the Miles Bridges situation clouds their future outlook quite a bit. But they are building around LaMelo Ball. They sort of fell in this group by default. They were another one that we didn't really have a great home for overall. But the one I probably had the most discussion with you about in this group was Oklahoma City. Obviously they really like their young core. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, to me, is the most underrated player in the NBA because he's been on a team that has really been off the radar by its own doing the last couple of years, but he is an awesome player. Chet Holmgren's obviously a big time talent. I know you had him number one in your model. Josh Giddey's an interesting player. I just wonder if they're still maybe fitting more in the next group for one more year. It's really one of the more interesting questions to me in the Western Conference this year is how much are the Thunder going to try to push forward and actually try to win some games? Because if they do, I think they have an outside chance of being up somewhere around the Portland, Sacramento, Lakers group. Because I think Shea could be that good. They're probably in the low end of that group, but they could, I think, make a push towards that group, or they could again be down in the group of teams that are, fighting for positioning in the lottery. It'll be very interesting to me to see which direction they go.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be like the last couple of years. We're gonna see an endless series of Poku isolations during the final month of the season for the Thunder before they even shut him down. I think last year at some point.
Yes.
Detroit and OKC are the ones that were really kind of right on the fringe of where do we put them relative to a couple of teams in the next group, which was all in for draft positioning. I mean, Houston and Orlando, who also had top 5 picks as Detroit and Oklahoma City did this year. Those teams are all kind of toggling somewhere between we still want to add more talent to this core and we love this group and we're ready to start going with it. I guess maybe the difference between those two is Detroit and OKC have more proven NBA players in terms of we've already seen a season from Cade Cunningham at a really high level, and in Oklahoma City's case, you mentioned Shea is the guy who separates them.
Yeah, that was the difference for me. And to list off the teams in the next group with draft positioning, we had the Rockets, the Pacers, the Magic, the Spurs, and the Jazz. And really, those teams all are either beginning a rebuild, which we'll get to Utah in a second, or are still clearly in the middle of a rebuild, right? Like you could argue to your point that the Pistons and Thunder are starting to want to try to win games, that they might have their core group together now going forward, and they're kind of in a position to start building on that. While these teams have differing levels of young talent, certainly Orlando and Houston more than others, they all clearly are, to me, going to be at the bottom of the league and in a much more of a battle for trying to be in the best spot to get Victor Wembanyama and Scoot Henderson than they are trying to get into the 8th seed in the Eastern and Western Conference playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Houston and OKC are an interesting question, the two of them. I think probably the difference is the Thunder have more guys who are farther along in their development process.
Yeah, they have Shea. I mean, that's the difference. They have Shea and the Rockets don't.
And the Rockets, they have, Jayshawn Tate is in that kind of age range, and they still have Eric Gordon as a veteran on the roster. But the guys who we know are going to be part of this team in 5 years are still extremely young and relatively early in their development.
Yeah, and we talked about this on the Hoop Collective a little bit earlier. The Jazz being in here, Windhorst, loves to talk about the Jazz. He pushed back a little bit on Utah being in this group. Why do we ultimately have the Jazz here, in your opinion?
Because I think we expect they're going to trade Donovan Mitchell sooner rather than later.
Yes, that is the very easy answer. I mean, when you look at what the Jazz have done, obviously they haven't done it yet, but Mike Conley, Bojan Bogdanovic, Patrick Beverley, Malik Beasley, all guys, Jordan Clarkson, all guys that could move in trades, I think, over the next 6 months to get more draft assets going forward. None of them seem likely to be in Utah long term. And then there's obviously the one big chip out there, which is the Donovan Mitchell trade, which, again, they haven't done it yet, but it's safe to say this team is built to tank. And, Donovan Mitchell is not long for Utah, whether it's 6 months or 4 months or 2 months or 2 weeks or whatever. At some point, he's going to be out of there. I think he's most likely to be here in New York, a few blocks down from where I'm at right now at MSG. But either way, that's why the Jazz are here, despite the fact that they've still got some quality veterans on this roster. We just don't expect them to be there that much longer. And this team has clearly started into the rebuilding phase.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of it is, look, this is more about how the front office views things than it is necessarily what the roster looks like right now. And the way that they made that Gobert trade, where nearly all of the important compensation was in the draft picks as opposed to the veteran players they received, even though, those guys could help them in the short term if they actually kept them on the roster.
Yeah.
That's what the signal was. And it also, I think, is a signal of what a Mitchell trade is eventually going to look like, where it's going to be more about the draft picks you get than young prospects, guys we're going to need to get paid in a couple of years here, whether it's RJ Barrett or Tyler Hero.
No question. I mean, Danny Ainge has done this once before with the Celtics, and he certainly seems like he's doing it again with the Jazz, which brings us to the final group, which is all in on nothing. So who is all in on nothing, KP?
Which I feel like sounds harsher than it is. What it really is we don't feel like these teams have picked a specific direction right now.
Well, in some cases it's harsh, and in some cases it's not, I would say.
Okay, yes, one case it's definitely harsh.
There's only three teams, so there's I would say two harsh and one not harsh, I would say.
That's the Dallas Mavericks, the Los Angeles Lakers, and the Toronto Raptors, who probably generated the most discussion between us about what to do with them before we came up with this tier.
Yeah, the Raptors are the reason we have this tier. And I got a little playful pushback from some people with the Raptors who were amused that we had them in an all in on nothing tier. But basically it was like the Raptors can go one of 100 directions, right? They have Scotty Barnes, the rookie of the year. They've got these veterans that are really good, and Fred VanVleet, Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, Gary Trent. Like that sort of group is in sort of the next phase of their career, a little bit older than Scotty Barnes. They have all their draft picks going forward. They've got a great coach in Nick Nurse. They've got a great front office of Bobby Western and Masai Ujiri. They obviously have championship infrastructure from winning a couple of years ago. The question now is, what direction do they pick? Like, like Fred VanVleet is a year away from free agency. Do they get him extended? Do they look to maybe start moving some of those older guys and really pivoting to building around Scotty Barnes going forward and trying to get guys in that age range? Do they try to move some of those draft picks to get some more players to help this team win right now? A team that, by the way, was in a pretty competitive series last year with the Philadelphia 76ers, despite the fact that half their team was hurt. Like, this is a pretty good team. I think they're going to be in the top 6 again this year if they just keep it as is. That was why they were here. We just couldn't really figure out a better place to put them because they're not quite in on their current core, because Scotty and the older guys they don't really line up timeline wise. And they're certainly not trying to be 500. So they ended up here because we couldn't find a better spot to put them.
I think of the Raptors, if you've got a video game map, they're at the spot where they've got a path here, they've got a path here, they got a path here, and they can choose any of those, which is a great place to be, as opposed to a lot of the teams on this list are, well, there's only one thing we can do at this point because we've kind of locked ourselves into this direction that we're headed. So that's why Toronto, it's a compliment.
Yes. So let's get to the teams that were not compliments, the Mavs and the Lakers. So let's start with Dallas. Why did we end up, because we had Dallas in a different tier initially. Why did we end up putting Dallas here?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I think we couldn't determine which of the tiers they belonged in. Are they trying to win a championship over the next 5 seasons? Is it just playoff success when you let Jalen Brunson go and get nothing in return for him in free agency?
Yeah, there's the reason. That's the reason why they were in another tier. When you let Jalen Brunson walk in free agency and you get nothing in return for him, it's hard to say you're all in on anything, because teams generally just don't let their second best player walk out the door. And while, the Mavericks said whatever, the Mavericks could have paid him enough to keep him, and they chose not to. Whether that was the right move or not, we'll see in a couple of years. Dallas would say, we're holding our powder here for a bit. We didn't need to overpay this guy. We're going to have max cap space in a couple of years. We can add some pieces down the road around Luka. Maybe they'll be right. We've seen, though, over the past decade that Dallas has tried over and over again to use cap space to get players, and it has not worked over and over and over again. So, we'll see what they ultimately decide to do. The other thing I'll point out is the Jalen Brunson contract is going to look pretty good to me in a couple of years. That contract is descending. The salary cap is increasing pretty significantly. Like, that's not going to look like a bad deal 2 years. I don't think it's a bad deal now. And it's really not going to look like a bad deal a couple of years from now. So, if I'm Dallas and I'm sitting there and, they just signed Tim Hardaway a year ago, who is not as good of a player as Jalen Brunson, and probably a big reason why they couldn't afford to re-sign Jalen Brunson, it's not great. So that's ultimately what pushed us to have him in this group, as opposed to obviously having Luke is great, but you can't say to me, you can't say you're on a championship now and over the next 5 years if you're probably a playing tournament team to me right now, or at least more likely to be that than the top 4 seed. And on top of that, you let your second best player leave and don't get anything back for him.
I mean, I think the other aspect of it that was a little confusing is, okay, if we're all about cap space down the line, why are we signing JaVale McGee to a 2+1 contract?
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, look, they had a weird summer. I mean, the Christian Wood trade, while I get it to a degree, there's a reason why he was on the block for a long time. That's going to be an interesting fit. He's in a contract year. It's unclear if he's going to start. Maxi Kleber is probably their best big. It's unclear if he's going to start. It's unclear how those guys are going to fit playing together all across the board. It's a lot of stuff going on in Dallas. It's going to be a very interesting year. And look, as McMahon pointed out on the pod earlier that we did, like Luka's playing in Eurobasket, he could come in and be the MVP of the league, and they could be awesome still. Like he's good enough that he might be able to overcome it. But this, I think I'll be curious to see what happens to Dallas. This team, I think, has a chance to look sort of like what the Cavs in the late aughts did right before LeBron went to Miami, where they kind of end up cycling through a bunch of desperation moves later on in his second contract to try to be good enough to win. And they had some really good teams. They almost won. They didn't win. They ended up leaving. I'm just Dallas, I think, is at least got the potential to go down a similar path if they don't execute this plan, because this is a big decision that they made. And, we'll see how it shakes out. But that leaves us with, of course, the Lakers. We have to always talk about the Lakers on every ESPN platform.
I thought you were going to transition with speaking of not executing this plan.
Well, I mean, look, the Lakers often have rotating plans. They just tend to usually not work. But the Lakers also in this all in on nothing tier. What was our rationale, KP, for how we ended up doing that?
Yeah, I think I wanted them to kind of be in the all in on 41 wins tier, because that's frankly where their performance merited, or all in playoff success, possibly one of those two. But your argument was that they're still not making the move that would really push them all in, which is trading these 2 first-round picks that they have available to deal.
Yeah, I got what you were saying, sort of like the Portland argument, right? Like if you look at this team, it's only so good. But to me, you can't say this team is all in on any direction when they have not done anything with the Russell Westbrook contract. They haven't done anything with these picks. They were sort of just sitting, right? Now that LeBron has signed this extension, it has put them in a position where free agency is sort of out the window next summer. They can't have LeBron take less money, have a max cap slot next summer. That's off the board. So because of that, to me, that takes the option of waiting with Russ and not making a trade pretty much off the board. Like at this point, they've got to try to turn Russ into something. The question is, what do they turn him into? Do they go to Indiana and try to get, say Buddy Hield, Miles Turner? They go to Utah and try to get 3 or 4 of those veteran players that are kind of sitting there on the Jazz. There's different directions they could go, because at this point, Russ has a gigantic expiring contract. They could do a lot with that. But that was why I voted to put him in this tier, because for better or worse, the Lakers haven't done anything really this offseason besides sign some young players instead of old players like a year ago to 1-year deals. And it sort of left them where you're kind of like, where are these guys going to go? Now, maybe in a month that'll change if they make a trade, but I think that's where they sit right now.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the trade deadline, where LeBron was so evidently passively aggressively unhappy with their unwillingness to give up that 27 pick that was the only one they could deal at that point, to try to do something to salvage that season. And I think they made the right choice, certainly not to throw bad money after good for last season. We'll see whether whatever upgrades they're able to make this year are significant enough to justify, putting themselves even more all in terms of their draft picks.
Yeah, that's going to be one of the interesting questions to watch, because as we know, if like in Brooklyn down the road here, if Russ and LeBron and AD are all on the team at the start of training camp, there's going to be a lot of sparks flying after what's going on this summer. So certainly that's going to be something to bear watching going forward. But that is the rundown of our All in Tiers piece. So KP, thanks for doing this. It was a great idea. I'm glad we did it. We'll have to make this an annual thing. I think it'll be a fun thing to do every summer, kind of see where teams are at. But check out all of our NBA content across YouTube's platforms for ESPN. Obviously, the Hoop Collective, which I'm on with McMahon and Brian Windhurst is going to be on there every week throughout the summer. We'll get KP back on there once we get going to 2 pods a week again here in the coming weeks. But thanks for following along and watching here, and we'll talk to you guys again soon.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.